Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today for the 15th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations. I'm David Marcotte, the president of the Psychology Coalition of NGOs at the United Nations. I'm very happy to welcome you to this event, an important conversation on the role of hope in the face of climate challenges. Let's begin today with this video. Dear friends, welcome to the 15th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations. In 1995, at a UN symposium on poverty, members discussed how psychological science might be integrated more effectively into the work of the United Nations. Chilean Ambassador Juan Somavia, then Secretary General of the UN World Summit on Social Development, proposed the creation of a coalition of psychologists to provide supportive consultation for the work of the UN. The Psychology Coalition of non-governmental organizations having consultative status to the UN Economic and Social Council was formed with representatives from 5 international psychological organizations with a mission to increase the contribution of psychology to the UN and its agenda. Today, the Psychology Coalition provides consultation to UN commissions and agencies, governments, and non-governmental organizations. It issues research-supported policy statements, conducts international research, and promotes the integration of global issues into psychological science and practice. Today's event, Psychology Day at the United Nations, is an annual professional meeting which enables us to hear from leading researchers and practitioners about a specific area of social concern. This year, our attention turns to building hope, contributions to a roadmap for climate action. As we will see, the issue of climate action richly illustrates the complexity of our 21st century challenges. They are deeply human problems that cannot be solved by one person acting alone, by one country, one discipline, or one NGO. Interdisciplinary, international, and multilateral effort is needed. To sustain hope for the climate and for all our contemporary challenges, the Psychology Coalition forms a network of people eager to imagine and foster the very best world possible, an international community built on friendship and shared resolve. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the presentations. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kaliani Gopal, President of Division 12, the Society of Clinical Psychology, and a co-chair of the Psychology Day Committee.
Greetings. Welcome to the 15th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations, a program organized by the Psychology Coalition at the UN. First, on behalf of the organizing committee, co-chairs, Dr. Efrat Neda and Dr. Vera Arroyo Suarez, our distinguished panelists, and the entire program committee, I wish to thank you for joining us today. This event was made possible thanks to the generosity of all our mission and NGO sponsors. Just like nature works silently in the background, ensuring we survive as a planet, we owe very special thanks to our Zoom platform manager, Timothy Lundveer. We echo His Excellency Abdullah Shahid that on issues such as climate change, we will never give up hope that humanity will rise to the occasion. There is no problem that exists that does not have a solution. It is just that we haven't found the solutions yet. Today's psychologists from 5 continents are rising to speak to you about how psychology can contribute to actionable solutions to pressing environmental challenges from the clinical, environmental, architectural design, social, and health psychology perspectives, addressing solutions to our current environmental concerns. Climate change is universal and ongoing. We cannot stop it. However, we are charged by our future generations to stop abusing the only planet we now inhabit, which is our Earth. We are charged with finding solutions to navigate and mitigate its negative effects, persuade skeptic fellow humans to reduce our personal and collective carbon print, address climate perceptions, and apply evidence-based adaptation and mitigation design strategies from macro systems using psychological frameworks for complex, durable conservation systems to recycling waste and water and using eco-products and eco-healthy foods within our homes. For example, psychological research has shown that providing free bus passes increases the use of public transport, a finding that's particularly relevant with eco-energy today. We are pleased that the UN acknowledges the contributions of psychologists, and it is time we come forward and take our rightful place in reducing environmental stress and fighting eco-harmful strategies against our planet. Our hope is that this webinar provides a springboard for debates on environmental conflicts and the future of our planet. Ample evidence with COVID-related eco-anxieties has transformed the average psyche, stressed the interdependence of human beings, and brought mental health front and center within the global arena. It is time for us to walk the walk, and we owe it to our younger generations, our children and their children, to hand over a sustainable, less polluted, mentally and emotionally healthier planet. And as you will hear from the 6 very accomplished speakers, we can actually achieve this catalytic climate action goal. There is hope. Some housekeeping duties are needed at this time. Please post your questions in the Q&A and chat box. Complete the program survey link at the end of the webinar for your attendance certificates. Psychologists, if you please, those of you who are registered, please complete the CE evaluation handled by Josephine within a week of this webinar. The panel program will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A section and end with a closing commentary by Dr. David Marcotte, who you just heard, and Dr. Gopal with closing remarks and a future call to action. And now, without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for today's wonderful panel program, Dr. Efrat Neder. Dr. Neder is a behavioral scientist working at Rupin Academic Center in Israel. Her research interests are primarily health behaviors, translating lab findings into large-scale population interventions, and she researches chronic health conditions. Professor Neder, who you now see on the screen, was a member of the executive committee of the European Psychology Society and is currently serving as a secretary of the Psychology Coalition at the United Nations, which is the host of today's webinar. She serves as a co-editor-in-chief at the Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine and associate editor at the Applied Psychology, Health and Wellbeing. She has numerous research publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neder as a panel moderator today. Thank you, Dr. Neder. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Gopal, for your kind words. I would like to introduce, and I'm honored to present His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, the President of the UN 76th Assembly, who said in his inaugural speech that hope is desperately needed. His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, has served as Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Maldives since 2018, served previously as a Speaker of the People's Majlis of the Maldives, and played a key role in the Maldives' transition to democracy in 2008. His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, was elected to the 76th President of the United Nations General Assembly with an overwhelming majority. He pledged to push for equal access to coronavirus vaccines, a stronger and greener economic recovery, and stepped up efforts to tackle climate change. In his uplifting central theme of hope, Mr. Shahid said cynicism is a path to inaction and could lull the international community into complacency and a false belief that our actions do not matter. He emphasized the importance of hope. Let us hear his words for us today.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Mr. David Marcotte, President of the Psychology Coalition of NGOs having consultative status with ECOSOC, for inviting me to speak. I was told today's theme of Psychology Building Hope, Contributions to a Roadmap for Climate Action, has been inspired by my presidency of hope. I'm deeply humbled and honored by this gesture. I was once asked what success would mean for my presidency of hope. My response was this: if I could imbue hope anywhere, in any small way, that to me is success. I believe today's meeting has elevated this message of hope, and I'm deeply appreciative. When I chose the theme of hope, I did so with an understanding that hope constitutes a common denominator for all of humanity. Hope is a mediator. Hope is a solution. Hope is both aspiration and a tool to achieve aspirations. It is a psychological solution that is needed today more than ever. Excellencies, dear friends, the collective toll and physical scars of climate change extend far and deep. The bushfires of North America and the southern hemispheres, the persistent and frequent droughts of Africa and the Middle East, the sea level rise threatening small island nations and coastal cities, the floods and torrential rains of Asia Pacific, the melting glaciers and sea ice of Antarctica. None of this planet are unaffected. Yet, climate change is not felt equally by all. Least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states feel the impact sooner and harsher. They have less capacity to prepare or to buffer against the impacts. While climate change is rightly a concern for the tangible and immediate necessities of life, such as land, food, water, and shelter, there's also an intangible psychological effect. For small islands like my own, the Maldives, the very threat of sea level rise affects people and communities on a deeply emotional and personal level, long before the water affects their lives. For a young person living on low-lying islands, for communities building back homes wondering when the next storm will hit, for farmers looking out for rainier days, the fear and inquisition of tomorrow fuels anxiety and uncertainty for the future. That is why today's meeting is so important. Psychology as a roadmap to climate action considers the intangible, emotional, and mental context of climate change. Human perceptions, behaviors, and mental well-being are affected by climate change. And the alternative is also true. Our feelings, perceptions, and behaviors can help chart a way out of the climate crisis or lead us to inaction if we deem to challenge too insurmountable. Excellencies, dear friends, today's discussion is about these very linkages between psychology and climate action. It recognizes that a cynical, hopeless population will be disinterested and demotivated, unable to pursue the kind of transformational changes needed to address climate change. The world needs fundamental changes at every level and across all sectors and societies. And we have it within our reach to undertake these changes. All we need is the political will to make it happen. We must be hopeful that it is possible. We must be optimistic for the future. And reaching for the possibility, we will build hope. Excellencies, dear friends, recent developments have given me cause for hope. The adoption of a landmark resolution on human rights and climate change by the Human Rights Council. The resolution is a culmination of more than 15 years of advocacy led by several countries, including the Maldives. The appointment of a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. The adoption of the landmark UNIA resolution, End Plastic Pollution, towards a legally binding instrument by 2024. Likewise, the outcomes of COP26, while far from ideal, also provided steps in the right direction. This includes the decision to phase down fossil fuels and deforestation. It is my intention to help build on this. In July, I will convene a Moment for Nature event, which I hope will serve as yet another opportunity to inspire hope amongst our citizens. This event will allow for an opportunity for member states and stakeholders to share strategies and bridge gaps on nature and climate action. I look forward to Coalition's contribution at these upcoming events and again welcome your commitment to tackling the psychological impacts of climate change and your messages of hope. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your words and for your presence with us today. It was really an inspiring presentation. We are now honored to welcome His Excellency Ambassador de la Fuente, the permanent representative of the Mission of Mexico to the United Nations, as our co-sponsor and to address us next. An authority in Mexico, Ambassador de la Fuente has a distinguished career as a psychiatrist, bringing his expertise to deliberations at the United Nations. A prolific intellectual, scientist, and academician, he founded the clinical research unit of the Mexican Institute of Psychiatry, served as dean to the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where he advanced treatments of addiction and mental health. He has written over 21 books and 300 scientific papers. Awards include 19 honorary doctorates and a public hospital named after him. His Excellency received the National Prize for the Sciences and the Arts, a top recognition in Mexico. As a Minister of Health, he created the National Commission of Medical Arbitration and introduced generic drugs. In the UN, he has served as a VP of the World Health Assembly, board chair of UN AIDS, and advisor to UNDP. As an ambassador, he is championing crucial UN priorities valued by the Psychology Coalition. Ambassador, over to you.
Good morning to everyone. Mexico is glad to co-sponsor the 15th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations, as we did last year. We are delighted to join forces once again with those who have been at the forefront of this issue at the UN. We'd like to thank the organizers, especially for highlighting the interlinkages between climate change and mental health. We believe this topic merits an in-depth analysis because it is seldomly discussed. Since Mexico became an elected member of the Security Council in January 2021, we have followed a simple but proactive strategy to promote the issue of mental health and psychosocial support as fundamental items in the paradigm of sustaining peace within the UN system. We have focused on giving these issues greater visibility in the debates and forums of the organization's main organs and in incorporating references to mental health in relevant resolutions at the Security Council, the General Assembly, and ECOSOC as well. Furthermore, we recently hosted an area formula meeting in access to mental health and psychological support in those situations of conflict, post-conflict, and humanitarian settings. I am happy to report that it was a very successful meeting, and we will soon be sharing a summary to continue strengthening the mental health agenda at the United Nations. The reason behind these efforts is very simple. Neglecting mental health, particularly of people in vulnerable situations, means we are heading towards a silent pandemic. Prioritizing mental health and psychological well-being, on the other hand, is essential for overall well-being and for the global health agenda. For those reasons, we commend the organizers of this event and for focusing on contributions to climate action. We can all agree that combating climate change requires an international and coordinated response. But these strategies also involve addressing the mental health consequences that may arise if we do not take action soon. It is no coincidence that for the first time, the 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report underscores the mental health impacts of climate change. For example, the report notes that mental health disorders, mostly anxiety and related mood disorders, are likely to increase under further global warming, particularly in children, adolescents, the elderly, and those with underlying health conditions. In addition, experts have also reported on the psychological consequences associated with extreme weather and climate events. I encourage everyone interested to read the report's recommendation aimed at reducing mental health risks related to climate change and promoting better psychosocial interventions. But most importantly, I welcome the opportunity to keep discussing this issue. We probably haven't been able to fully witness the true impact that climate change will have on our overall mental health and emotional well-being. So let's make sure we act now before the true weight of inaction makes its full mark. Thank you very much, and most successful meeting to all of you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Juan Ramón de la Fuente. The Psychology Coalition is fortunate to be collaborating with you. And thank you for all you do and for all your presence and for your presence with us today and for your inspiring words. And I'll pass on to my colleague, Dr. Efrat Netter.
Hi, the event is sponsored both by the Dominican Republic and Mexico. I would like to extend our warmest thanks to the Dominican Republic Mission for its long-term support and sponsorship of us. The Dominican Republic has been a founding member of the UN, has been actively involved in many of the UN initiatives, including those related to human rights, such as women's rights, the elderly rights, domestic violence, peace and security. This year, His Excellency Ambassador José Blanco also sponsored this activity. His Excellency is a career diplomat, has been with the Dominican Republic Mission at the UN for almost 2 decades. He served as an acting Vice Minister for bilateral foreign policy between 2017 and 2019. Before moving on to the speakers and their presentations, I would like to remind you, our audience, that at the end of the 6 presentations, we will have a Q&A section. We have a team of the organizing committee, Olivia Friedman and Taylor Mulligan, looking at the questions, assembling them, and we hope to take as many questions as possible. If we do not manage to answer your question, you can drop an email to PCUN or put a question at the chat with an email. We will share the questions with the speakers who will respond to each question. We'll now move on to the first speaker. Dr. Greenspoon is a clinical and climate psychologist and serves on the board of directors and steering committee of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America. She is faculty and supervisor at the Manhattan Institute of Psychoanalysis at the Adelphi University postgraduate program in couples therapy. Dr. Wendy Greenspan has presented papers and workshops nationally and internationally on climate psychology and provides workshops and courses for mental health professionals on ways to work with climate distress and grief. She has created training videos for mental health clinicians. She has served on national and international panels on climate anxiety. She also provides workshops on building emotional resilience for climate activists and university students, and has run group forums such as climate cafes for processing climate emotions. She's in private practice in New York City, specializing in the treatment of climate distress. To you, Dr. Greenspan, and she will speak about From Tears to Hope and Courage.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this annual Psychology Day at the UN. I feel really honored to be presenting alongside so many esteemed colleagues. I'll be presenting a clinical psychology perspective on the climate crisis, considering the ways we can work with our emotions and build psychological resilience. As a clinician, I often think of myself as a professional listener of sorts, and I reflect a lot on the importance of listening. In the face of the enormity and the complexity of what's going on in the climate and environmental crisis, we really need to listen to a variety of inputs, numerous voices and perspectives to face the challenges. So to begin with, I think it's essential that we listen to what's happening on the earth and understand the intersecting environmental crises that are occurring, starting with greenhouse gas emissions, which we know is leading to a warming planet. There's also deforestation, which reduces carbon capture. Biodiversity loss is embedded in these intersecting crises, and that means harms to numerous ecosystems. There's the sixth mass extinction, devastating loss of species in our world. We also see soil degradation, soil loss, soil erosion, which is impacting the health of crops. Fresh water depletion is occurring, which is leading to water scarcity and drought. There's also ocean acidification, the disruption of the ecosystems of our seas. All of these have multiple impacts that are embedded and amplifying of each other. We also need to listen to those who are already suffering and try to understand the intersectional socio-political harms that are embedded in the climate and environmental crisis. We do know that ecological destruction and social injustices such as colonialism and systemic racism have often very similar roots. These include attitudes of domination, of exploitation, of extraction, and a lack of awareness of our interconnection. Along with these intersectional harms that are occurring are inequities in climate impact. So those who are contributing the least to the problem and who have the fewest resources for coping are experiencing the greatest climate harms. And that's really horrible to consider how much inequality is embedded in the climate crisis. In this way, we will be in the same storm, but in very different boats. We need to also listen to experts, including scientists who are doing the research and providing us with data from which we can learn and understand the magnitude of what's happening. We also need to listen to those who are trying to make change, who are working together to come up with solutions and face the numerous challenges that are embedded in the climate emergency. Some examples of this include the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In their most recent report in February of this year, it was a really urgent assessment. They describe the magnitude of what's occurring, that destruction is affecting billions of people throughout the world already and will continue to amplify. They also describe the embedded levels of injustice that are part of the climate crisis, as I was just describing, and how much inequity and marginalization are entailed. What was very useful was that they described the tools and solutions that we have to move forward in equitable and sustainable ways, but that this will require that we really transform our way of life substantially. And so this is really quite daunting and quite urgent. There's also the Conference of the Parties. The most recent was COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 in the fall. Delegates from almost 200 nations came together. And again, this is an attempt to forge new ways forward that address the problems. The stark reality that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by 45% by the year 2030, which is, it's so hard to even contemplate how we could do that. That's just what we need to keep alive the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. The Glasgow Climate Pact came up with numerous pledges from countries on how to reduce many of the harms and to boost cooperation among nations. And we'll need to continue to put pressure on all the parties to be able to meet those pledges. We also need to listen to young people, those who are facing a foreshortened future. And I wanted to cite this recent large-scale survey of young people ages 16 to 25 across 10 countries. It was quite sobering to hear their responses to climate inaction. 83% of these young people said that they believe people have failed to take care of our planet. Almost half of them reported difficulties in their daily functioning. Levels of distress, not surprisingly, were highest in those already experiencing direct impacts of climate change. And over half of these young people reported various distressing emotions and even said that they felt that humanity is doomed. So it's quite a lot to take in. We also need to listen to the numerous mental health impacts. We do know that existing health and mental health vulnerabilities are exacerbated in the face of climate change. So, for example, as temperatures rise, we see increased levels of violence and decreased cognitive capacities. For folks who are living in degraded environments and suffering various kinds of environmental injustice, like higher levels of pollution, degraded environments, lack of green spaces, we see increased levels of depression, anxiety, and grief. And we know from extreme weather events like wildfires, floods, droughts, there are all kinds of traumatic responses, post-traumatic stress, loss of identity, a loss of a sense of security. So mental health impacts really get amplified. So after outlining all that we need to listen to, what are the psychological barriers that we face to engaging with the urgency and necessity that is required? Why do we tend to bury our heads in the sand, turn away from the enormity of this problem? One concept I have found helpful with this is Timothy Morton's idea of the hyperobject. He said that global warming and the climate emergency are hyperobjects, which are defined as things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to human. These are experiences so enormous we can't see the contours, we're embedded in the problem, so it's just overwhelming to even contemplate. In relation to a hyperobject, we often have a trauma response because it goes beyond our capacity to adequately cope. It's just too enormous. We also know that there are psychological defense mechanisms, ways that our minds and our psyches protect us from feeling overwhelmed. And defense mechanisms are useful and necessary, but when they become overutilized or rigidified, they prevent us from fully engaging with our feelings and then engaging with the problem itself. One such defense mechanism that I think we see with a lot of prevalence in the climate crisis is disavowal. And that is that strategy where we know the reality, we know the difficult truth on one level, but we push it out of our minds. What's useful is knowing that we can dismantle defenses, we can help to soften them, but it takes compassion and support to be able to face these underlying painful emotions. So here's where we consider what psychology has to offer. And I think of this in terms of managing distress and helping us stay open to the truth. As we come out of disavowal, we often see a variety of kinds of traumatic stress. And I'll start by describing pre-traumatic stress, which was my colleague Lisa Van Susteren's idea of the stress felt by people not yet experiencing the direct impacts of climate-related events and change, but feeling anticipatory distress, often referred to as eco-distress, eco-grief, eco-anxiety. We also see what's defined as disenfranchised grief. That's a grief for a loss that has not yet occurred. For most kinds of grief, we have rituals for mourning, but for a loss that has not yet happened, there are no rituals, and that makes it really hard to process the emotional experience. We should also consider that pre-traumatic stress may reflect an aspect of privilege for those who've not yet faced any kind of existential threat. It's real nonetheless, and something that can be helped by processing the emotions, talking with others, joining with others, and taking action. Another kind of traumatic stress is what we most commonly think of, the acute traumatic stress, the post-traumatic stress that occurs as a reaction to an extreme weather event or acute climate disruption. This could include wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, floods. And here we need interventions that include community sources of help, disaster response, ongoing trauma treatment of various kinds. There's also pervasive or ongoing trauma resulting in what Eagle and Kaminer call continuous traumatic stress. This is from continual ongoing climate disruptions, various forms of environmental injustice, toxic exposures like high levels of pollution, and embedded psychosocial traumas like systemic racism. What's difficult about continuous traumatic stress is rather than a discrete event that can resolve and we can get past and then face in the aftermath, this kind of trauma is ongoing and pervasive and really requires systemic changes, community supports, elevation of community leaders who understand the culture and the community and can provide leadership. So I want to shift now to talking about how do we build psychological resilience. And here I often use the idea of our psyches as emotional ecosystems that need to find sources of sustainability. So in this way, if we get too out of balance, we can't function adequately and with a sense of wellness. So we really need to find sustainable resilience practices. When we think of resilience, it's also important to not just consider getting back to business as usual, because the business that brought us to the brink of this kind of crisis is not what we want to continue. We want to find new ways and aim to foster stronger capacities. In this way, we consider forms of post-traumatic growth. So to build emotional resilience, I think about working with our emotions and helping to move us from tears and distress to experiences of hope and courage. To do so, we need to work with the emotions in a variety of ways. First, we need to identify and face those difficult emotions. We need to find ways to cope with those emotions and then to transform those emotions into something useful. So to identify the difficult emotions, it's first important to recognize them as expectable, reasonable, understandable, and often even useful. Here I've listed a variety of kinds of emotional distress that we see in the face of the climate crisis. They exist on a continuum in terms of level of intensity and severity. They often coexist and can even include a numbing or desensitization or paralysis. To work with the emotions, we need some form of emotional engagement as well as regulation of those emotions. So we want to make room to process, to validate what feels painful. Often that helps to do in the presence of a supportive other or a group of others. We do know that becoming unsettled can challenge us to grow, and so it's useful in that way. And we want to really consider the ways that positive emotions can sit alongside our distress, and we can try to cultivate some positive emotions. Dan Siegel had the idea of the window of tolerance, which I find really useful. So that's finding the emotional range where we don't feel overly distressed, but we're also not under distressed or suppressing our emotions in self-protection, finding that middle ground where we really can engage and work with our feelings. One way to do that is to calm our nervous systems. We know that when we experience threat, whether anticipatory or more directly, we can have sympathetic nervous system arousal. That's that fight, flight, or freeze response. So we need to find ways to bring on calming of the nervous system. I listed some of those strategies here: meditation, mindfulness, breathing, deep breathing practices, listening to music, going in nature, and so on. Another resilience strategy comes from Bob Doppelt, who's done a lot of work on individual and community transformational resilience, and he calls this purposing. And it's kind of what it sounds like, finding a sense of purpose and meaning in the face of difficulty. Often this entails honoring one's values, thinking about our ethical principles, our spiritual grounding that gives us purpose and meaning. It also can include building optimism. And here I use the definition from positive psychology that optimism is focusing on what we can control rather than dwelling on the many things that we have no control over. Purposing, of course, includes taking useful action, and that can mean starting with individual behavior change, joining with those in our neighborhoods and communities to create important change and action, and building from there. This relates to the next resilience strategy, which is building connection and a sense of community. We do know that with all kinds of stress, social support is incredibly helpful in mitigating the worst of it. Sally Weintraub, a climate psychology colleague in the UK, describes the need to foster a culture of care. When we take action with others, we build a sense of solidarity. We don't feel so alone. And we do know that social tipping points can happen as we build social momentum. Gigantic change can occur that was not expected previously. Another resilience strategy that often gets overlooked is our need for replenishment. Again, going back to my idea of the emotional ecosystem, we can't just deplete all of our emotional resources. I've talked to many climate activists, climate scientists that are frantically trying to work on the problem, but not taking the time for good self-care, getting enough sleep, eating well, getting exercise. Creativity is another replenishment strategy that brings enormous pleasure. Spiritual practices can be really grounding and cultivating joy wherever we can. Another source of resilience is focusing on our sense of interbeing. This is Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of our connection with all beings across the planet. So any practice that connects us to the land, to the more than human, as well as to other human beings, can be really stabilizing in our lives. We can also learn lessons from natural ecosystems that emphasize the health in diversity, in reciprocity, and in interconnection. And my last idea for resilience is learning from the wisdom of those who have already been suffering. There is so much knowledge and wisdom and understanding from those communities who have been suffering, but who have found ways forward. So we really need to listen. And I'll end with this quote by James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I thank you so much for listening to me today and to be willing to face what's so difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greenspan, for your illuminating words. And I would like now to move to Dr. Brendan Barnes from Johannesburg University. Dr. Barnes' research focuses on psychology, environment, and health in the global South. He has worked on studies of air pollution, urban housing, lead poisoning, mercury, as well as water and sanitation. His contribution to this field include identification of the association between toxic environments and child development, critiquing the concept of behavior in environmental health, highlighting the role of activism in environmental health promotion, and developing the research methodologies using the study of environment and health. Key projects include the Behavior and Household Air Pollution Project, the Household Environment and Development Project, and the Politics of Environmental Health Project. Dr. Barnes will speak about psychology and climate action in the global South, local realities, digital pictures.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Brendan Barnes, and I'm speaking to you today from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. My topic today focuses on psychology and climate action in the global South. I am going to speak about my work on youth activism in relation to climate change, and I'm going to focus specifically on the need to understand local realities and respect local realities, and also give some comments on digital futures. So we were challenged today to think about the concept of hope. Now, hope is a very interesting and complex concept. It is a powerful concept that has resonance in society and can be potentially impactful. I also know hope is a particularly rich concept that has also been studied extensively within the discipline. But rather than think through and define hope in terms of the global South and climate action, I really asked myself the question of where can I find hope in terms of psychology and climate action in the work that I do among youth climate activists. My starting point for this talk is really about my entry into the discipline of psychology and its relationship with climate change, and really trying to grapple with how we position ourselves as psychologists in relation to climate change in the global South. Now, this entry really started way back with me being very interested in how do we design, implement, and evaluate behavior change interventions to protect people from environmental destruction, from environmental toxins, from environmental harm. And so I began my career very early on thinking about how we implement these behavior change interventions and think about their effectiveness. I did studies on indoor air pollution, studies of water and sanitation, studies in relation to inadequate housing, and studies in relation to very well-known neurotoxins. And the key question was, how can we encourage people to change their behaviors to protect themselves from this destruction? Now, two things became very clear to me very early on. The first was that actually these kinds of interventions that were thought about from the top and were imposed almost on communities in the form of health education tended to be ineffective. There were signs that it was effective, or that they were effective initially in the short term, but over time, we really start to see that these interventions tend not to make much of a difference. There was also a political concern of mine, and that is many of these interventions were actually focusing on poor Black women in Africa. And the burden of them protecting themselves from environmental harm at the expense of us looking upstream, at the expense of us looking at the polluting industries that are causing the damage in the first place, really made me feel uneasy. At the same time, I started to acknowledge and become interested in the many, many environmental movements that were starting to take shape in relation to climate change in particular. And two things sort of dawned on me as my work progressed and as I continued to do studies looking at how do we intervene. And the first is that it is really crucial to understand and respect local realities. We really, really do not have much of a chance if we don't understand what's going on the ground. And in my case, if we don't understand what's happening within climate movements themselves. The second learning point for me was that we should consider leveraging what people are doing already. There is a lot of activity in relation to youth climate change activism. So let's understand and let's facilitate and work with them to enable us to get somewhere, both as a discipline, but also in terms of really mitigating the impacts of climate change. So this is where I start off, and this is how I hope to frame this particular talk. I wish to make 3 points. The first point is that hope can be found on the margins. And here I find hope in relation to marginalized youth really claiming their voice and reclaiming their voices when those voices have been excluded. The second thing I think that marginalized youth activism is doing really well is in relation to intersectional climate justice. And the third thing, I think, where there's a lot of activity and where I think we've been a little bit slow in the discipline of psychology is to really think through the impact of the digital sphere, of digital technologies and of social media and the fourth industrial revolution in relation to how activism is taking shape at the moment. I'll then move on to talk about the possibility to leverage what people are doing already and to get behind social movements by understanding what's happening already. And then I'll make a few comments towards the end of the presentation about reimagining a role for psychology in relation to climate activism, particularly among the youth. So the first point that I wish to impart focuses on activists reclaiming voices. Now, the starting point for this particular talk was the often widely held misconception, I believe, that African youth and youth generally in the global South are not that interested in climate change, are not that active in climate activism, and of course need certain kinds of help in order to do so. And we find this in a lot of spaces in the media, even in academic writing. So I wish to disrupt this a little bit and show how activists are in fact highly active and are also doing incredible work to have their voices heard. So to begin with, let me state that activists in the global South have a very hard time in terms of how much they are undermined, how much abuse they receive online and in the real world, and also in terms of how they continually having to justify their presence. And this applies specifically to African youth activists, but also to other activists around the world. In the global north, also marginalized youth involved in climate activism. Now, there are many ways in which these activists are undermined. The first and most obvious point I want to make is the violence that often these activists have to endure. If we can just pause and reflect on the fact that over 200 murders of land and environmental defenders happened in the year 2020 alone, speaks really to the high levels of violence that activists often experience. Activists in the studies that I've done are also subject to incredible abuse and undermining because of their gender. For example, they are deemed too young or too emotional to be able to handle the activism and the strength that's perceived to be needed in climate activism. They are questioned about their motives. They are questioned about who they claim to represent. They are questioned in terms of where they are located, and some even saying that African activists should stick to African issues and not venture out into global issues. They are undermined in terms of their race. But I think for me, the real issue here is that often activists in the global south or marginalized groups in the global north have to fight on two fronts. They have to fight the issues that they are confronted with. They are heavily involved in climate change activism, and they're fighting on that front. But they also have to fight to have their voices heard within climate movements. And this is really interesting to me, how much double fighting needs to happen in order to have their voices heard. Now, what's really interesting here is I present a case study to you of the cropping out of an African activist, Vanessa Nakate. Now, in early 2020, a group of young women climate activists were engaged in various discussions at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Following these discussions, a picture was published of the activists. You will see the top picture that was published, but the original picture included Vanessa Nakate, who can be found at the bottom left. Vanessa was excluded from the picture that eventually made its way in the press release, and Vanessa obviously was quite upset by it, rightfully so, and accused Associated Press of racism because they cropped her picture out. The only Black person, the only African activist was left out of the picture. Now, this form of digital erasure is quite interesting because the Associated Press immediately denied accusations of racism, saying that Vanessa was removed and cropped out because of the composition of the photos. They claimed that there was an unsightly building behind her, and she was removed to remove the building. And of course, this logic doesn't quite cut it, and there was a huge furore around the issue. Importantly, Associated Press didn't apologize initially and didn't actually apologize at all for the racism, but did eventually apologize to Vanessa about the damage and the hurt that they may have caused. Now, this led to a number of things. It led to Vanessa using this in terms of her campaign to emphasize the point that this digital erasure or cropping out didn't just erase the photo of Vanessa, it also erased the continent. And here's a quote on the slide from Vanessa immediately after the cropped out incident, where she says, "You didn't just erase the photo, you erased the continent, but I'm stronger than ever." Now, sadly, this was not the only kind of digital erasure that happened. Over an 11-month period, 2 other Black women activists had similar experiences. One, Toni Nauschen from Germany, who experienced a similar incident, and also Elise Yard, who experienced the erasure of an important message by the media. Now, this is just one example of a form of erasure, a form of undermining that activists have to endure. But rather than being passive recipients of this kind of undermining, what's particularly interesting in the case studies that I've studied is how activists, including Vanessa, use their agency to make particular points. For example, Vanessa Nakate used this incident to really demonstrate what she suggests on the slide, that actually her experience is an experience that is symbolic of the widespread neglect of Africa. Subsequently, she engaged in many interviews, and quite surprisingly, she was actually attacked and undermined in many, many spheres, including by the media in Africa, also because of her accusations of racism. But whenever she was attacked, whenever she was undermined, she would use that experience to demonstrate how people are being used in various ways or are being excluded in various ways in the climate, mainstream climate activism discourse. So if she was being attacked because of her emotional reaction, she would use that as an indication of how women are treated. Most importantly, for this discussion, there are incredible moments where Vanessa Nakate, as well as other activists, are actually fighting back, are using the incidents again to project a different future for young climate activists, or projecting, using projective agency, to use the psychological term, to really think through the future and to use the experiences to reimagine a role for African climate activists or marginalized climate activists more generally. One thing that Vanessa did particularly well as many other activists around the world from marginalized groups, is that they focus on intersectional justice. Now, here I want to make a point that for a very long time, climate activism really revolved around focusing mainly on what I would call green issues, and that is the natural world, biodiversity loss, ecosystem health, and so forth. And this is all well and good, but more and more so, young activists are coming to the party to point out the historical legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and the history of injustice, and how that carries through to the present, and how we cannot isolate climate justice and only focus on green issues. We also have to include social justice, we have to include racial justice, we have to include issues of gender, and we have to include geopolitical issues in terms of justice. So these are really important strides, I believe, in the fight for climate activists and in terms of intersectional justice, and they are doing remarkably well on this front. And we have plenty of examples. There's too little time now to show how more recently, particularly over the past 3 years, people have been coming together and groups have been forming, ranging from grassroots movements to more established movements to civil society organizations to the legal world, importantly, the legal world, coming together to fight certain environmental issues and climate issues. Now, much of this activism is actually happening in the digital sphere. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe psychologists have been a little slow to the party to understand what's happening in the digital sphere. The activists themselves are highly active, and particularly in the global south, where actually the reach of cell phones, smartphones, and the internet is growing. And there's a hell of a lot of activity, local reality activity in the digital sphere. I was recently very intrigued by the use of social media in terms of climate activism. I'm particularly interested in how social media enables the formation of climate groups, climate activist groups, some of the barriers to social media, some of the enablers to social media, and also some of the technological infrastructure that is needed. And again, by understanding what's happening in the digital sphere at this point, I believe is crucial for us as psychologists in order to get behind and support and perhaps even bring our skills to the party in terms of helping people along or facilitating climate action. Another area I think that we could do a little more work in is in relation to the internet and evidence. Now, there's a lot of fake news that gets pushed out there. There's also a huge political agenda to foster ideas of climate denialism and to counter some of the narratives that are being put forward by climate activists. And I do think we can do a lot more, both in terms of making the evidence that we have available, for example, on the impacts of climate change and mental health, make it much more available and much more user-friendly to activists and grassroots movements through the digital sphere. I also think there's tremendous opportunity in thinking through the idea of disaster management and the role of technology, social media, and digital technologies in relation to that domain. So I'll end the talk to suggest that unlike me, who started out thinking that psychology has something special to offer and thinking through ideas that we could help communities by bringing some of our ideas and cutting and pasting ideas from psychology into communities and resource poor communities themselves and learning some hard truths about how communities mobilize. I think we have tremendous amount of theory, skills, and methods to facilitate climate action. But I do think amongst psychologists and those aligned to psychology, we need to think more broadly and move away from single issue psychologies. We cannot be working in silos, and we have to be working across fields of psychology to really get behind what's happening on the ground. We also need much more work in the global south to speed up transdisciplinary work in relation to psychology and other disciplines, as well as other sectors in society. We really need to work with communities to help think through some intervention, some action in terms of mobilization, in terms of moving away, I believe, from what I call top-down psychologies. And most importantly, we need to understand and respect what's happening on the ground already. And in the case of my work, to really understand what's happening in terms of climate action and youth climate activism and what is happening on the ground already. And rather than working with communities, we really need to rethink our terminology, rethink our approach, and also to engage and embrace concepts such as allyship, accompaniment, and stewardship, and to really, really, really embrace and get behind the idea of intersectional justice, not just thinking about single issue psychologies or single issue climate change. And this is in the hope that we can actually develop a more engaged and responsive psychology. I thank you for your time. It's again a real honor to have been invited today, and I look forward to the discussions that are going to take place later today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. And we would now move on to Andrew Sarah Abraham, who is trained in both architecture and environmental psychology, thus equipped to teach and work interdisciplinarily in architecture and planning. She is passionate about human psychology and the relationship of human behavior with the built and natural environment, and inspires her students to think about design using human-centric methods to develop socially conscious and sustainable design ideas. Her areas of interest lie in place attachment, sense of place, and place identity, and she explores innovative ideas for human-centric design and its effect on users and thereby the environment. Ms. Abraham will speak about using architecture and design to promote mental health and enhance positive climate action.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Efrat, for a very kind introduction. I would like to thank the organizers of the Psychology Day at the United Nations for giving me an opportunity to speak here about architecture, mental health, and climate action. Architecture is the built realization of a particular concept or idea. This idea can be about construction or the way people will use a building or how the building fits into a physical or a social landscape. Architecture is often driven by the desire to solve problems, from the earliest construction, which is necessary to provide security and shelter, to more recent examples of architectural skill used to take advantage of vertical space. This is a section with a focus on progression and problem solving. The way in which architecture has changed over time provides a very fascinating insight into the development of the human race, from the influence of the industry to technological progress. Buildings are created for humans. Most designers nowadays consider this to be a secondary factor, but then the energy exchange that takes place between humans and places creates a dialogue, and this connection deepens, developing a very, very intimate moment. Yes, this is the kind of bond architecture creates with the human mind. Architecture has never just been about planning, zoning, materials, or structures, but it is always about creating an expression for users, satisfying their needs, and responding to the context. Therefore, the design of our built environment affects our health and well-being and can have long-term implications for quality of life. Whether people are healthy or not is determined by their circumstances and the environment. According to World Health Organization, to a large extent, factors such as where we live, the state of our environment, genetics, our income and education level, and our relationships with family and friends all have very considerable impacts on health. This relationship between architecture and health has historically received little to no attention beyond the design requirements of healthy buildings. Most of the research in this area has emphasized on ill health as a result on the effects of environmental characteristics such as overcrowding, noise, air quality, and light. Moving on to sustainability and architecture. Before the Industrial Revolution, most of the architecture was in nature, as they were based on the adaptation of climate and local materials to meet the demands of the people. Traditionally, Indians lived in a joint family system. Many occupants of the house and their interpersonal relationships demanded clearly distinguished spaces for different activities. There were private and public zones in the house with the courtyard as its nucleus. These houses were very high on the sustainable quotient. They were designed to suit the climate, the anthropometry, the Vastu Shastra, and using of local building materials and techniques for construction. However, in the current scenario, the traditional building has been replaced by fast-growing concrete jungles, which are really not sustainable and sensitive towards the natural calamities and microclimatic conditions. We have sadly come to poorly designed housing, workspaces, transportation, and recreational spaces that at best stagnate and remain unused in worst-case scenarios, cause chronic physical and mental health issues for its inhabitants, contributing to the spread of disease, waste resources, and diminishing the overall sense of well-being and efficiency. In a newly opened office high-rise in downtown Beijing, most occupants were reportedly feeling uncomfortable every day. It was a very tight building, of which central ventilation system provided mechanical air supply, but really no natural exhaust. A survey was conducted and concluded that 98.7% of its occupants had sick building syndrome. Architecture has moved on from being locally attuned and environmentally responsible to aesthetic pleasure and financial development. A building can always be retrofitted, or new buildings can be designed to be more sustainable. Although buildings and their operation are responsible for a significant percentage of total greenhouse gas emissions, ultimately, they are inhabited and operated by human beings. So merely creating an architectural environment conducive to sustainable behavior is not sufficient. Feeling good and functioning well are characterized as the two key elements defining the notion of well-being. Feeling of happiness, curiosity, and engagement are characteristics of someone with a positive sense of themselves. Sustainable behavior means taking into account the need to preserve the planet for present and future generations, while taking into account economic, environmental, and social development. There has been little research completed on the measured effects of sustainable design on human behavior, either in or around a specific built environment. Sustainable design must not only concern itself with the productivity or well-being of the occupants, but also on the behavior of those people in and around the structure. For there will not truly be a movement towards sustainability without a change in people's behavior and activities, which will definitely change the built environment and its surroundings. There, coming into environmental psychology and the various theories that are part of environmental psychology. There are two focal points in environmental psychology, and thereby connecting it with design. The first, which I'm involved in and doing a bit of research in, is looking into the influence of the environment on the individual as human behavior, cognition, affect, physiology, etc. Examples include restoration, which is basically mood improvement and stress reduction, or wayfinding, which is basically how people find their way in an unknown building or city, or place attachment, which concludes a physical characteristics that make people get attached to a certain place. The second part of this is conservation psychology, which focuses on the relationship between people and the natural world, and how to support environmentally friendly behaviors to conserve this natural world. The restorative effects of the environment have proven to have a very positive impact on humans, where they feel like being close to nature can provide restorative effects, which in turn has helped in the whole design of indoor built environments into bringing landscape and natural features within the built spaces itself. Several concepts relating to humans' innate connection to natural environments have been revealed by environmental psychology research. Nature's connection has been shown to play an important role in predicting people's general pro-ecological and pro-social behaviors. Nature restoration, basically, there are the various studies that reveal that patients with a view of nature from their hospital window recovered way faster than those with a brick wall, demonstrating the extent to which nature has mental and physical restorative properties, which has been a central branch of the field. Another thing is place identity and attachment. Time and experience in a place are necessary for deepening the meanings and emotional ties at the heart of person-place relationship. While place attachment is defined as emotional or affective ties to a location, and is thought to be the result of long-term connection with a specific environment. This is distinct from a simple aesthetic response, such as saying that a specific location is special because it is beautiful and creates a sense of place. We all have place identity and attachment. Involuntarily or voluntarily, we do have favorite places, and this can be related to how our behavior is, how we have been brought up, and how our personality can be a part of which place do we identify with and where do we find our sense of place. Another very important design related application in environmental psychology is wayfinding. Wayfinding problems have been associated with negative physical and psychological effects. For example, Schumacher and Reinstein pointed out that in healthcare settings, wayfinding problems can lead to confusion, frustration, anger, stress, elevated blood pressure, headaches, and fatigue. Wayfinding problems have also been found to negatively affect how people view businesses, for example, shopping centers and hospitals, etc., which can cause visitors to interrupt staff to help finding their way. There have been various research based on this. Environmental psychology aids in understanding the real-world applications of concepts such as spatial cognition and cognitive mapping to design easier to navigate spaces. Crime rates can be reduced as a result of the practical application of environmental psychology. Having good signage inside buildings increases the rate of travel within the buildings, and using color-coded paths can reduce wayfinding errors in buildings. All human thoughts and behaviors occur within one of the numerous physical environments, each within its own set of distinct characteristics. The environment can be dissected at multiple levels, ranging from noisy, crowded offices to quiet, open fields, and from one's private bedroom to the entire natural world. Moving into how an urban level setting and also a housing level setting can be worked about in terms of design and thereby helping in promoting sustainable behavior. We can look at the UK government's Foresight project related to well-being, providing a definition to the 5 ways to relate to improved well-being. Thinking about city planning, the provision of local everyday public spaces creates opportunities for people to connect and thereby creating a wider community. Design characteristics associated with increasing activity, which includes access to physical activity, facilitates and promotes access to destinations and improved walkability. Walkable cities are one of the most important design considerations that should be followed throughout in the city planning process in the future, because walkable cities is what makes a city more sustainable, thereby helping people reach from their home to a particular destination just by walking or by cycling to that particular place. Design interventions can help people in taking notice, like the provision of art, planting, landscaping, wildlife features, etc. Natural and built environments that can cater to learning and provide with the opportunity at home and in the classroom. Also, lastly, providing opportunities to give back to the environment by promoting helping behavior and increasing altruism among the urban population. Most people spend majority of their time indoors, yet we are only informed about the effects of outdoor ambient environmental conditions on our well-being. Factors such as air quality and movement, daylighting and sanitation are all indicators of a quality of space, which can thereby help or even at times reduce our comfortability within a space, and thereby also alter the psychology of humans within spaces. So looking at air quality and natural light and active design within us indoor space can help in booming the human psychology of being more comfortable within a space and thereby help in well-being. To promote sustainable behavior, indoor spaces should be capable of providing with comfortability and safety. Many design factors in terms of improving the air quality, in terms of improving the temperature within a building structure, and also in providing a good daylight within an indoor space can help in booming a very good sustainable behavior within humans as well. We can also look at creating spaces that creating indoor spaces that can provide good daylighting within the spaces, and also working with color psychology and different ceiling heights and curved forms, which can efficiently help with altering the psychology of humans in the indoor spaces, especially in our homes, and help in creating a more conducive and a comfortable environment. Looking at workplace design, the way an office is designed can impact our attitude toward work on a psychological level. If an environment isn't conducive to the way you work best, it could negatively impact your productivity, quality, and general job satisfaction. There are 4 behavioral factors that affect designing a workplace. Design that addresses the thinking cognitions of the individual, design that understands the depth of emotional needs of an individual, design that is in tune of the intuitive needs of people, and design at its core becoming a sensory result of the needs of people in order to strike a balance. We spend most of our time in our workplace. Even though COVID set back a lot of us working in our home, but as most of us are moving into offices, and a lot of the community who has always been working in a particular workplace, having a good workplace design can largely impact on the psychology of our minds. Having a good workplace design can obviously increase productivity, but at the same time improve job satisfaction as well. Human beings, even though we do not consider workplace design to be a very voluntary factor that can help in psychology, being in a good workplace can effectively improve our well-being, and thereby help in us realizing that being in a good workplace can thereby improve job satisfaction and can thereby improve the work productivity as well. Human beings, even though they don't consider themselves to be environmentally conscious, contain a genetically ingrained emotional connection to the natural world. Built environment that emulates elements of the natural world will improve the physical and psychological conditions of the individual. And this inclusion can also improve the condition of the built environment. Inclusion of natural elements in the built environment will likely cause an increase in emotional affinity toward the natural environment. Looking back into the workplace design, right now, nowadays, a lot of biophilic design style is being used in the workplaces because it has been proven that nature can provide restoration. Biophilic design is basically design that uses maximum of nature within our indoor spaces, with the inclusion of indoor landscaping, a lot of greeneries being used, and a lot of elements within the interior spaces with the use of sustainable materials and locally sourced materials. This is a direct relation to how natural restoration can help in providing good well-being within workplaces itself. Again, moving back and looking into sustainable architectural design, inclusion of natural elements will obviously increase the emotional affinity toward the natural environment. Looking into sustainable behavior through architectural design, like I was speaking about, the building good air quality and having environments that can acoustic conditions that can create opportunities with a clear demarcation between noise to cause that creates stress, and also demarcating between contact with the neighborhood and nature that can help invaluable to comfort as well. Using the 5 senses of our body, which is seeing, listening, touching, feeling, tasting. So all of these can be utilized to provide a good environment within the indoor setting itself. We can provide environments that can bring in nature towards the indoor, that we can provide scenery that with greenery inside. We can also provide acoustic conditions that can imitate or mimic the sound of the waves or the ocean or the sound of chirping birds. These are all different design characteristics that can be brought within built environments that can help in providing a more sustainable architecture and thereby promoting sustainable behavior as well. Again, moving into looking into environmental psychology, there is also another theoretical model called the behavior change model. The reasoning was directly associated with the supposition that if people were better informed, they would become more aware of environmental problems and consequently would be more motivated to behave in an environmentally responsible manner. The behavior model, although very simplistic, provides a base for the consideration of possible relationship existing between environmental knowledge, environmental awareness, and attitude on how these can translate into action or inaction. Like we have been discussing about, being in an environment that is conducive towards using locally sourced materials, sustainable design factors, and also promoting more sustainable behavior can help in altering a human's behavior into taking more actions towards environmentally prone behavior. So environmental psychology is crucial within home and outside the home. It focuses on environmental stressors such as outdoor sitting noise, pollution, congestion, and crowding. An hour of running in an urban environment versus one in a natural setting will have a distinct psychological impact on you. If you go for a walk or a jog on a busy urban street with a lot of traffic and noise pollution, your level of arousal and tension may arise when you get back. A nice walk behind a lake, a river, or a small park, on the other hand, will instantly lower your stress level. If it were the intention of the designer to promote and affect environmentally friendly behavior and concern in its users, an effective method of accomplishing this goal would be to establish a level of connectivity between the building's users and the natural environment. People can be nudged into making better decisions in a largely automatic, non-coercive, and simple way through changing what Taylor and Sunstein refer to as choice architecture. But can really architecture create choice architecture? Behavioral changes are possible if appropriate theories are applied from environmental psychology for designing outdoor and indoor environments, which will make humans capable in living comfortably and at the same time start to behave pro-environmentally. This is what we have been discussing about, and I hope we have understood that design-led interventions and also using appropriate environmental psychology theories to create environments where people essentially live in, can help in creating better choices and also constrain behaviors that might not really be environmentally friendly. Thank you for listening to me. And I would like to conclude my talk by quoting Winston Churchill. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much for a very instrumental and practical angle. We will now move to Professor Matthew Hornsey, who is a social psychologist. He has published over 170 papers, mostly on themes of intergroup communication, trust and trust repair, and sustainability and climate change. His most recent work focuses on understanding and reducing people's motivation to reject scientific consensus, including the psychology of climate skeptics. Professor Hornsey is currently director of the Business Sustainability Initiative at the University of Queensland in Australia, a multidisciplinary team of academics tasked with providing leadership and practical solutions for climate change and resource-constrained future. He's also a co-investigator in the Rapid Switch Initiative, which seeks to identify, anticipate, and communicate industrial, regulatory, and social constraints that might impact the pace of decarbonization of the global economy. Dr. Hornsey will speak about understanding and reducing climate change skepticism.
Thank you for coming along. My name is Matthew Hornsey. I'm going to be talking to you today about climate change skepticism. Who are these climate skeptics? What drives them? What can be done to draw them into the fight against climate change? And I'm going to open by showing you a quote from 1965. This is the then US President Lyndon Johnson in a special message to Congress, effectively just ringing the alarm, just saying that the science was already starting to show that the burning of fossil fuels and the CO2 releases associated with that were changing the atmosphere and that this could have dramatic consequences. When Lyndon Johnson made that comment in 1965, the science hadn't yet really fully settled on that, but very quickly it did. And we saw these predicted increases in temperatures and that those increases in temperatures happened as predicted in lockstep with the increasing CO2 emissions. And 97% of climate scientists agree that that's what's going on. But despite that consensus, there's significant community pushback against that notion. The levels of climate skepticism vary across the world, but I'll show you here data from Australia, which is my country, representative data from 6 months ago. And if, I guess, from an optimistic point of view, you say, well, 59% of people are saying, yes, climate change is happening and it's caused by humans. But that also means that there's a lot of people who don't believe that. Nearly 1 in 3 Australians say, well, all we're seeing here is natural fluctuations in the Earth's climate. Humans don't really have much to do with it. Or there's 11% of people who, despite 50 years of concerted scientific messaging around this issue, say, well, the jury's out. We don't really know what's causing climate change just yet. So effectively, we have 4 in 10 Australians overruling the scientific consensus. That's a big number. It's less than it was. And you see this across the world, actually, a dropping off in the rates of climate skepticism. But in some countries, and particularly in Australia and America, and some other countries, the numbers are still alarmingly high. Why would people reject scientific consensus? Well, one argument is that people just aren't cognitively sophisticated enough to understand the science. They don't think analytically enough, they're not educated enough, they're not science literate enough, etc. If this is true, then the answer is to train people to think more like scientists, to be more analytical in the way they approach evidence. One way to look at this is just to measure education or to measure science literacy. Other people just ask people whether they like to think in analytical ways, because some people don't. They prefer more intuitive ways of thinking. Or you give people analytical problems to solve and you've got to try and answer those questions. And I'm not going to say that these things don't matter. We do know that cognitive sophistication matters. The problem is it just doesn't matter that much, and particularly when it comes to big issues like climate change that have been discussed at great length. So if it's a totally new scientific attitude, then cognitive sophistication tends to matter. But with things like climate change, the evidence is there, but it's just not very strong. I'll show you some of that evidence in a second. Another argument is that people just haven't heard the right arguments. So from this point of view, you can imagine that climate skeptics, their heads are empty of the right information, and we just have to pour that correct information into people's heads, and then the climate skeptics will be converted. So from this point of view, our salvation is in science communication. We need more of it, and it needs to be better. The problem with this explanation for climate skepticism is that there's just not a lot of evidence that it works. Sometimes myth busting and education programs do have small positive effects on the attitudes of climate skeptics, but frequently they don't. Sometimes you get these reverse effects where people become even more climate skeptical, which doesn't seem to make a lot of intuitive sense. Why would information not transform people? Well, one answer to that question is the third major explanation for climate skepticism, which is motivated reasoning. So, when we talk about evidence and information transforming people, we're relying on the notion that people behave like cognitive scientists, that they actually weigh up that evidence in an even-handed way before they reach a conclusion. So that's what scientists would do, or what scientists are supposed to do that. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that for many people, they don't really behave like that. They behave more like cognitive lawyers. So from this point of view, they've got a conclusion in mind. They've got a preferred outcome, and they're going to selectively critique the evidence and selectively remember the evidence and selectively expose themselves to the evidence in a way that helps them reinforce that conclusion that they want to reach. So that quote on the left is from the Simon and Garfunkel song, "A person hears what they want to hear and disregards the rest." That's effectively the principle of motivated reasoning. And people are very good at it. And so if you see the world through the lens of motivated reasoning, as I do, the question pivots. The question is not so much why would people reject the science, but rather why would people want to reject the science? What is their motivation to reject climate science? And that's a question that Kelly Fielding and I were grappling with when we came up with this metaphor of attitude roots. So it's a simple tree metaphor. We designed this to apply to a whole bunch of scientific attitudes. But above the surface, we have the surface attitudes. These are the attitudes that come out of people's mouths, the actual arguments they express, whether it's about climate science, vaccines, evolution, etc. And of course, it's very tempting to focus on what people are saying with their mouths, and most people tend to focus on surface attitudes. Of course they do. But what we're arguing is that you should try and focus instead on what lies underneath the surface. Things that are often unsaid. And this is what we call attitude roots. And these are the things that motivate the surface attitudes. These are the things that answer the question, why would people want to reject the science? It's the attitude roots that give the surface attitudes strength and make them resilient, even in the face of contradictory evidence. And if you read our work, you'll see that we talk about a whole bunch of attitude roots down there, like worldviews, social identities, anxieties and phobias, vested interests. But what I want to do today is really talk about ideologies, because this is the one that seems to be most relevant to our discussion of climate change. And when we talk about ideologies, we often talk about free market ideologies here. So with the free market ideology, people are saying, well, I don't want governments telling businesses and telling individuals what to do with their lives. Like, people prefer small government over big government. They don't want to see a lot of regulation. And for people who have that worldview, climate science is sort of a nightmare, because in many ways, the solution to climate change does imply a big government response designed to regulate the activities of individuals, but more importantly, to regulate the activities of business. And so if you find that a morally toxic solution, then people are more likely to want to reject the science, right? Rather than coming on board with the solution that that science suggests. How do we know these things play a role? This is the results of a meta-analysis that my colleagues and I did. A meta-analysis is where you take a whole bunch of studies from around the world and mash them together to get a bird's eye view of what's going on. And what we're trying to do here is to predict belief in climate change. So these numbers are correlations with belief in climate change. The further away from zero, the bigger the correlation. And you can see that things like free market ideology are very important here. To the extent that you believe that markets should operate in an unregulated way, you're less likely to believe that climate change is real. Also, there's other ideologies that are relevant. Individualism. You know, where do you stand on the rights of the individual versus the rights of the community? More individualistic people are less likely to believe in climate change. Hierarchialism. Do you think that hierarchies are normal and natural parts of life? Or are you more egalitarian? Or hierarchical people tend to be less likely to believe in climate change. And it's fascinating that these ideological variables do so much work in predicting climate skepticism, because they don't refer to climate science, they don't refer to science at all. But they outpredict a whole bunch of things that you'd expect to be highly relevant, like extreme weather experience. Have you personally experienced droughts or floods or extreme weather events? If you have, you're more likely to believe in climate change, but the effect is tiny. People with high levels of science literacy and educated people are more likely to believe in climate change, but again, the effects are much smaller than these ideological variables. You see that also come out in the demographic literature. So very small effects of sex and race and income. We've seen that education effect. Younger people are slightly more on board with climate change. But the biggest predictor, the thing that blows everything out of the water, is political affiliation. Who do you plan to vote for? Do you have a conservative political orientation or a more left-wing political orientation? So when we're looking at these kind of effects of worldviews and ideologies, I'm mindful that probably half the samples that we used in that meta-analysis were from America. And that made me nervous because I was thinking, are we telling a universal story here about conservatism? Or is this an only in America sort of phenomenon? So we collected data from all around the world, and I apologize in advance for this very complex graph. But it's telling a fairly simple story. So what we're doing is we're looking at a whole bunch of correlations between political conservatism and climate skepticism across 20-something nations. What you're looking at there is correlations. The further to the right of that vertical dotted line, the stronger the relationship between political conservatism and climate skepticism. And one thing you can see is that actually for many countries, probably 3/4 of those countries, there's no reliable relationship. There's nothing inherent to political conservatism that makes people reject the climate science. It's interesting to look at those countries where the relationship is there, and it's much stronger in America than anywhere else. Second strongest is my country in Australia. And we did actually notice a pattern around the countries that showed this relationship. It tended to be very fossil fuel reliant countries with high per capita carbon emissions, and countries where the stakes are high. You tend to see this relationship between conservatism and climate skepticism. Okay, so let's pivot and talk about what can we do about this. If I'm right, and that a lot of the rejection of climate science is a case of motivated reasoning, people wanting to reject the science, then just repeating the science is missing the point. It's probably not going to work out. Some people have used the metaphor of shadow boxing. When people are arguing about climate change, you think you're arguing about evidence, etc., but really it's about something else. And possibly you've had that experience where you're having an argument with a climate skeptic, trying to persuade them, and you feel like you're just killing this argument because you're coming with all these great pieces of evidence and data, etc., landing one killer blow after another, but the other person doesn't change. They're not being converted. I would say that that's perfectly predictable because it's missing the point about what's driving the skepticism in the first place. In terms of knowing what to do about this, Kelly Fielding and I use a different fighting metaphor, which is around jiu-jitsu, judo. These types of martial arts teach people not to take on people's force directly, but to work with their momentum. So if you're a lightweight person, you can still defeat a heavyweight opponent if you use their force against them. You can use momentum, leverage, gravity, etc., to win the fight. And I use this as a metaphor for persuasion. Don't try and just mash data on people's faces and pretend that their underlying motivations don't exist. You've got to try and work out what the underlying motivations are, and then come up with messages that align with those underlying motivations. And if you do that, it'd be amazing how much resistance goes away when you're kind of swimming with the stream as opposed to trying swimming against the stream, if you know what I mean. So what do we know about climate skeptics? Who are they? What are their values and their worldviews? They're more likely to be conservative, particularly in high carbon emission countries. And so what do? You use language and you use messages that appeal to conservatives. It's a very pragmatic approach. What would that look like? Well, there's plenty of studies on this showing that if you frame climate mitigation as an act of national security, which is the theme that conservatives are particularly interested in, then you tend to get more success in capturing their attention and getting them to be more pro-environmental. Sometimes people can frame climate mitigation as a way of protecting a way of life, protecting the status quo. You can frame it as an act of patriotism. I've got data showing that if you frame it as something that's going to trigger green technology and green jobs, then conservatives are more likely to listen. Some people have shown that if you talk about it as an expression of personal responsibility, this is a conservative value, people are more likely to listen. More so than the traditional frames, which typically are around themes of environmental harm, themes of justice. These are kind of traditionally left-wing moral foundations. By the way, there's also evidence showing that conservatives are more likely to accept climate science when they're led to believe that there are free market-friendly solutions to it. This comes back to the free market ideology point. Remember, they're not rejecting the science, they're rejecting the solution, which in their mind involves lots of government regulation. But if they're led to believe that there can be free market-friendly mechanisms to try and reduce this problem, they no longer feel the need to reject the science, right? Because the solution is not as toxic for them. One last message as well is that we have to understand that if you're trying to influence a particular group of people, it's better if you use messengers who come from that group. These messenger effects tend to be very large in my experience, but if you're trying to influence conservatives, then they're more likely to be influenced by other conservatives than by people on the other side of the political fence. We see this with the urban-rural divide as well, that farmers, people in the country, tend to be more influenced from organizations that are rural organizations than from urban organizations. I'll be very reluctant as an Australian to be preaching to the rest of the world about how they should operate to defeat climate change. I think one thing that the data teaches is that sometimes you have to step away from the microphone. And that myself, for example, as a left-wing urban environmentalist with certain values, might be less effective than some other people in terms of sending this message. So we have to be smart about what we're saying, we have to be smart about how we're saying it, and we have to be smart about who is saying it. The who is very important. So this is my last slide, just take-home messages, kind of reinforcing what I was saying. Don't feel as though facts are going to be enough. Evidence won't necessarily be our salvation. Many people have heard the evidence, they just want to reject it. You need to understand your audience. Never imply that skeptics are stupid or poorly educated. You shouldn't do that out of politeness, but also because the data suggests they're not stupid and they're not poorly educated on the whole. Always scan for underlying motivations and fears that might be driving these attitudes and driving their skepticism about science. Use in-group messages whenever possible, and wherever possible, try and frame your messages in ways that appeal to what your audience values, rather than starting from your head and projecting attitudes outwards. The whole principle of communication is that you start from your audience's head and work backwards. So we need to have, we need to be pressing buttons that are important to the people we're trying to persuade, not pressing buttons that are important to us. Thank you for your time. Feel free to contact me on email if you've got any questions. And here's just a little review of some of the articles that I've been talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hornsey, for showing us the way forward. And I will now move to we will now move to Dr. Anne de Smet, who is a psychologist and behavior change researcher with an interest in multi-behavioral interventions, persuasive technology and methods that have the potential to engage users in healthy and pro-social behavior. Dr. de Smet has always been interested in health in its broader sense, and her research interests therefore logically include planetary health and how health and pro-environmental behavior can complement each other. She conducts research on spillover effects between health behavior and pro-environmental behavior, on how green space can influence well-being, and on societal acceptance of mitigation and adaptation measures. And is also a member of the European Federation of Psychological Association Group on Psychology and Climate Change. Dr. de Smet will speak about promoting planetary health behaviors by addressing spillover and shared underlying determinants.
Hi, thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. Most of my research is on behavior change, and during my work in this field, I became aware of how health behavior and pro-environmental behavior are interconnected and may be targeted together. So I wish to share with you some ideas and research on the connection between these two. Climate change and health are connected in several ways. Climate change affects our health outcomes, affects our health behaviors, but our health behaviors can also be key in trying to mitigate some of the climate change. Climate change can have direct effects on health, such as when rising temperatures and air pollution increase the risk of diseases and negatively impact our mental health. It could also impact health indirectly, such as when rising sea levels cause population migration and reduced availability of food, leading to an increased risk of conflicts. Climate change can also impact our health behaviors. In some colder regions, rising temperatures can make outdoor physical activity more likely, whereas this will be the reverse in warmer climates, and will in any case reach a limit when extreme temperatures are reached, also in what is currently a colder climate. Climate change decreases the sufficient availability of nutritious food, getting enough sleep, outdoor physical activity in some cases, and it increases the risk of alcohol consumption. For example, a study demonstrated that people in regions with high air pollution were more likely to consume fast food after correcting for the influence of socioeconomic status. It is assumed that the toxic influence of pollution creates a change in neuronal structures in the brain that are responsible for food seeking. However, our healthy lifestyles can also help mitigate some of the risk of climate change. Certain food consumption, using motorized vehicles, turning up the thermostat indoors, drinking alcohol, all have a negative impact on both our health and on climate change. For example, thermal comfort, or keeping the indoor temperature constant at a comfortable level around 22 degrees Celsius, compared to varying with mildly cold temperatures such as between 16 to 19 degrees Celsius, increases the risk of weight gain and obesity, as in this case our body burns less calories to keep our body temperature constant. If we can change these lifestyle behaviors, we can impact both our individual and environmental health. This perspective for this is, moreover, that for both health and climate change, we need to change multiple behaviors to impact planetary health. Several studies have shown that multiple healthy lifestyles, such as sufficient physical activity, healthy diet, not smoking, limited alcohol consumption, are needed to substantially reduce our risk of mortality. Also, to reduce the trend of climate change, multiple behaviors are needed. We can think of the example of the low-impact man shown on his improvised lawnmower here, who made changes to more than 30 areas of his life and still only approximated the reduction in his individual carbon footprint that would be needed to reduce climate change. So how can we then proceed to kill two birds with one stone, or in a more animal-friendly way, feed two birds with one seed? When changing multiple behaviors, we look at which behaviors tend to naturally co-occur in people, as these may then be associated or serve similar functions. For example, physical activity and a healthy diet often form one cluster, as they both serve to manage our weight. People who tend to eat healthy also tend to be more physically active. And interventions are then set up that target these similar behaviors that may have the same functions together. To create joint interventions, it may therefore be useful to know which health-promoting and pro-environmental behaviors tend to co-occur and can be targeted together. Next, behaviors that co-occur often share the same determinants. Determinants are mostly modifiable factors that predict or motivate the behavior, such as knowledge, attitudes, what the norm is in their social group, habits, how confident they feel they can perform a certain behavior. Thinking of smoking and alcohol, for example, these may both serve to help relax, relieve stress, or are performed in a social setting where everybody smokes or drinks. And these behaviors may therefore share the same determinants. Targeting these determinants may then help to change both behaviors at once. Thirdly, when one behavior is adopted, this may increase or reduce the likelihood that a next behavior is also adopted. This is referred to as positive or negative spillover. These mechanisms of spillover are important when we try to achieve multiple behavior change, as negative spillover effects would reduce the ripple effect we are hoping for in changing multiple behaviors. Looking first at co-occurring behaviors, a special case of co-occurring behaviors are actually single behaviors, but that have benefits for both outcomes, and they're called co-beneficial. So co-beneficial behaviors that have received most attention are active transport, such as bicycling to work, for example, which as a form of physical activity promotes our health and as a replacement for motorized transport reduces climate impact. The other one is sustainable healthy diet, which amongst others includes reducing our meat consumption, reducing our overconsumption, and increasing fruit and vegetable consumption, and as such positively impacts our health, but also reduces climate impact by reducing the space that is needed for herd grazing and the associated deforestation. Some less often studied co-occurring behaviors can be added to this. As mentioned earlier, turning down the heat in colder seasons can help save energy use and can increase the energy that our body itself needs to produce, which also has both climate and health benefits. We talked about reducing overconsumption of food. Of course, our body needs food and especially needs nutrients to stay healthy. It, however, does not need products that are of low nutritional value. And yes, this is going to hurt. One does not really need chocolate or candy or coffee or alcohol. And limiting or completely cutting out what are called empty calories that add to the risk of weight gain but provide little nutritional value can benefit health, and reducing the resources needed for manufacturing, distribution can also reduce climate impact. So how can we then address these behaviors in interventions and make sure people adopt these co-beneficial behaviors? We can use messaging on the consequences of behavior to change the behavior. A study examined whether framing the consequences of the behavior as good for health had different effects than when it was framed as good for the environment. they found that either a health or an environment framing was effective and was more effective than if there was no framing at all. When framing it from a health perspective, however, effects on behavior were larger if people had a higher sense of personal confidence they could adopt the behavior, referred to as self-efficacy. Whereas for pro-environmental framing, it was important people felt that together as a community, they could make a difference, referred to as collective efficacy. While these interventions on co-beneficial behaviors are promising, there are many behaviors that need to be tackled to impact planetary health. And so we also need to try to address behaviors that are not necessarily co-beneficial, but are nevertheless in some way connected. So apart from co-beneficial behaviors, we could also have behaviors that are similar, for example, because they fulfill the same functions, such as transport or meeting a certain need, such as relaxation, stress relief, social aspects, or they take place in the same context, such as leisure time or work. And to explore whether certain health and pro-environmental behaviors shared similarities and co-occurred, we conducted an online survey in West European countries. We selected 5 health behaviors that have a high impact on various causes of morbidity and mortality, such as fruit and vegetable consumption, moderate to vigorous physical activity, alcohol consumption, smoking, and sleep. And we also selected 5 behaviors that impact climate change, such as active transport, red meat consumption, air travel, recycling household waste, and using energy from renewable sources. In a factor analysis, we then assessed which behaviors scored similar in participants' responses. And so such an analysis looks for covariations between items that can reflect a common underlying construct. So people who respond highly on one behavior also respond highly on another, for example. And then this means that these behaviors are similar or can be grouped. And so those who gave high ratings for fruit and vegetable consumption, moderate to vigorous physical activity, also responded higher or also had higher ratings for active transport. And so this variable was then called energy balance related behaviors. Those who smoked more, drank more, also used more air travel, which we refer to as hedonic behaviors, as self-indulging behaviors. Those who ate more red meat also recycled more of their household waste, which was referred to as consumption behaviors. And lastly, there was a grouping of sleep and lower use of renewable energy sources. And so this latter may be a bit of a surprising combination, but there was 40% of participants who did not know the level of the renewable energy in the offer. And so it may reflect more of a take it easy, laissez-faire, everything's fine, we don't worry. So what this shows is that we do find behaviors between health behaviors and pro-environmental behaviors that can be grouped, that are similar as they co-occur in people. Our behaviors are usually driven by personal values, and values direct many different actions in several domains, whereas the behaviors themselves are concrete actions that help to achieve these values. For example, if being broad-minded is an important personal value for someone, talking to people from other cultures or traveling may be a behavior that can help meet these values. And so we assessed how each of the planetary health factors correlated with personal values, and found that the energy balance related behavior group significantly correlated with values of self-direction, which refers to creativity, freedom, curiosity, also with stimulation, which refers to having a daring and challenging life, and universalism, which is broad-mindedness, caring for a world at peace. The group of hedonic behaviors, comprising smoking, drinking, and air travel, only correlated with hedonic values such as self-indulgence. Take it easy behaviors of sleep and renewable energy use also correlated with hedonism, but also with stimulation and self-direction. And then the group of consumption behaviors such as high red meat consumption and recycling only showed a negative correlation with universalism. So the higher they scored on these behaviors, the less broad-minded they were, the less interested at a world in peace. The fact that these planetary health clusters share similar personal values offers opportunities for interventions where values can be primed to activate them for those who are already influenced by these values. Personal values tend to be quite stable across time, and changing these is not easy, but there can be windows of opportunity to influence values when people are in life transitions, which tend to be the time when they might revise their values, such as leaving the parental home, settling down with a partner, having children. And so messages could be tailored to these values. Looking at shared determinants across behaviors, we saw earlier that individual self-efficacy may be more important for health than for pro-environmental behavior. So we assessed whether health and pro-environmental behavior would share some similar predictors, because targeting these same predictors could then affect both types of behaviors. I apologize for the technical table, but it is useful to know that a higher beta value, which is shown in the third to last column, shows that these are more important predictors for the behavior listed in the row, and that a slash means that this predictor did not significantly contribute to understanding the behavior. We included as predictors the individual self-efficacy, I'm confident I can do this, efficacy as a community, collective efficacy, measured as together we can do this, and with a growing interest in the influence of eco-anxiety, we also included fatalism, there is nothing I can do about this, worry, thoughts about this cause me to worry about what the future may hold, and well-being, as behavior change is often facilitated when people have a higher sense of well-being. And so the most important predictor across health and pro-environmental behaviors is self-efficacy. And self-efficacy can be increased by helping people monitor their behavior, increase the belief that they can do it, emphasize the achievements they've already made, giving them a possibility for guided practice, showing how it can be done, and giving feedback and support at each step. Collective efficacy only plays a role in pro-environmental behavior, and to a much lower extent than self-efficacy. And worry predicts some behaviors in both health and pro-environmental issues. We could also extend this list. This is not exhaustive, with other determinants such as attitudes. And lastly, as mentioned earlier, to make an impact, we need programs on multiple behaviors. So when changing multiple behaviors, programs are not always effective in achieving a change in all targeted behaviors. And this may be due to spillover effects. Imagine you're starting with switching off the lights when you don't need them as a good habit, and you may feel more confident then to also start doing other things for the environment, or you may feel more positive about values and an identity that is more green, so you continue to also reduce your consumption of meat and eat more fruit and vegetables. This is what we would call positive spillover. One behavior leads to an increase of another pro-environmental behavior. Positive spillover occurs when a skill will also help with a next behavior, when we feel more confident to tackle these behaviors, when the first behavior facilitates the next, or when a first behavior has reinforced a certain identity or values that also fit with the next behavior. However, we may also experience negative spillover. Feeling that we've spent so much time on switching off all the lights, we may feel that we have no energy or time left to also tackle other environmentally friendly behaviors. And instead of walking to the bakery, we drive. Or we may feel that we have done a good deed with switching off the lights, and now we are allowed to do something a bit less positive for the environment to reward ourselves. We may think that the effects of one good deed may cancel out the effects of another less environmentally friendly behavior. The same patterns of positive and negative spillover have been observed for health behaviors. For example, doing exercise may make us feel more able to also go to bed on time, or may make us feel like we've earned that beer and bag of crisps. Spillover has mostly been studied within health behaviors and within pro-environmental behaviors, but given the interconnections, we could also assume spillover can occur between health and pro-environmental behavior. So far, little research has examined such spillover. Our study examined self-reported spillover within health behaviors, within pro-environmental behaviors, and one between health and pro-environmental behaviors. In general, the averages show that positive spillover occurs most often, both within health, within pro-environmental behaviors, and between health and pro-environmental behaviors. However, this measure was self-reported, and ideally, we would be able to observe behavior in a longitudinal way so that we can really say that this behavior has occurred first and this has led to a next behavior. Our measure also did not investigate whether spillover occurred going from difficult to easy behaviors or vice versa. And given that negative spillover can occur, this is important to know, as it can be risky to start promoting low impact behaviors and assume that this will create a ripple effect to the more difficult ones. If then negative spillover occurs, then people may instead conclude that they have done their good deed with the low impact behavior and no further efforts are needed, and in that case high impact behaviors would never be reached. How to increase such spillover? It has been shown that it's important that the framing that is used in messages increases environmental concern and also increases green and healthy identity, and that combined health and pro-environmental messages may be more effective when trying to create spillover between health and pro-environmental behavior. To conclude, we've seen links between health and pro-environmental behaviors that offer potential for joint interventions in several ways. Certain behaviors are co-beneficial, and the list of co-beneficial behaviors may be longer than what we are currently looking at. Framing benefits of behavior in either health or environmental perspectives can increase the chance of adopting a co-beneficial behavior, and for spillover, it may also be interesting to have more combined messages. We've seen that behaviors cluster together, also across health and pro-environmental behaviors, and that these are linked to personal values. So tailoring to these values in interventions may be important. Apart from values, personal efficacy has shown to be an important predictor for health and pro-environmental behavior, and we need to communicate in ways that reinforce the good efforts that people are making, increase their beliefs that they can do it, and guide them in how to take on new behaviors, and avoid messages that only increase worry without also trying to make them feel more capable of handling how to contribute to a better future. Thank you for listening, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. De Smet, for highlighting the spillover phenomena. And we will now turn to our last speaker, Vera Arroyo Suarez, who is a professor of health psychology and planetary health at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and past president of the European Health Psychology Society and regional vice president of the Psychology Coalition at the United Nations. Dr. Arroyo Suarez completed her studies at the University of Minho in Portugal. Mm-hmm. Her research targets the development and assessment of evidence-based interventions with user and stakeholder engagement for the promotion of health behaviors, prevention, and self-management of chronic conditions. And recently, she attempts to apply behavioral science to the pursuit of health of the planet. Dr. Arroyo Suarez is passionate about using knowledge developed in her area of research to support the planetary health agenda. Her presentation will integrate the contribution of the previous speakers and focus on psychology's role, both in increasing hope and action. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Effort, for your kind words.
It is really a big responsibility to integrate all of these fantastic contributions that clearly demonstrate the evidence-based knowledge amassed across the years by clinicians and researchers across different areas of psychology. And I will give it a go. When listening to all the contributions, key themes from the talks can be identified on determinants, actors, interventions, and outcomes, with inequities emerging as transversal to all the themes. Greenspoon's presentation made it clear that there are several mental health impacts associated with climate change, and that we have psychologists trained to deal with this. Abraham linked psychology with the built environment and evidence that it can shape our health and our actions. Barnes and Greenspoon demonstrated that it's crucial to understand and respect local realities, voices, and perspectives. Both presenters highlighted that inequities of climate impacts, those contributing the least and who have fewest resources, are experiencing the greatest harms. Greenspoon and Hornsey identified key psychological barriers to engage in change and introduced some of us to the concepts of hyperobject and attitude roots. Both Hornsey and de Smet demonstrated the importance of framing messages to overcome climate denialism and to increase mitigation behaviors, tailoring messages to ideologies and values. De Smet introduced us to concepts of co-beneficial and co-occurring behaviors and shared evidence that seems to demonstrate shared determinants. In my reflection, I will build on this, and I will particularly highlight the links between health behaviors and climate change and why it is important to understand these links. I will also present resources that I believe could be useful in order to transfer psychological knowledge towards better and fairer measures to combat climate change. Well, on the links between health behaviors and climate change, I first introduced to you a paper that is currently in pre-publication at Open Science Framework, or OSF. Here we try to understand how behavioral science can contribute to both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And we started doing this by identifying bidirectional associations between climate change impacts and health-related behaviors. To do this, we synthesized the existing literature about, first, the inputs of rising temperatures, extreme weather events, air pollution, and rising sea level on individual behaviors. For instance, eating behaviors, physical activity, sleep, substance use, and preventive care. And second, we tried to synthesize existing literature on the concurrent positive and negative roles that health-related behaviors can play in mitigation and adaptation to climate change. This figure here synthesizes the associations found in this work. Here we can visualize feedback loops between climate change and health-related behaviors, highlighting that, first, climate change is shaping health behaviors, and that in return, health behaviors might have different impacts on climate change outcomes. Based on this literature review, we propose a first conceptual model of climate change and health-related behavior feedback loops. Key actions are proposed with particular consideration for health equity implications of future behavioral interventions. Whatever interventions we propose, they should not increase inequities. Actions to bridge the fields of behavioral science and climate sciences are also proposed. In this paper, we also contend that climate change is amongst the most urgent issues facing all scientists, and that psychologists also should face this as a priority. Another study that we are currently conducting is trying to gather evidence from expert psychologists to understand what can be generalized from decades of research on health behaviors to other mitigation behaviors that have health co-benefits, such as reducing red meat consumption and increasing active transport. In effect, there is a lot of research already on health behaviors, research on the determinants of healthy eating behaviors, for instance, and interventions already tested to increase healthy eating behaviors. There is also a lot of research already conducted on determinants of higher levels of physical activity, as well as on interventions to increase physical activity levels. The goal of this research that we're currently conducting is to learn from this past research and potentially generalize it to behaviors that can have, to mitigation behaviors that can have co-benefits. To do this, we are using a repertory grid technique with interviews with expert psychologists. We are currently preparing a paper on this and will present this year at the European Health Psychology Conference in August on results. The reason we are doing this is because the current challenge is too great and we need to use as much evidence as possible that is already available. Indeed, the consequences of climate change can already be observed. Millions and billions of children are exposed to a variety of climate and environmental hazards. And this is very much linked with inequities, as you can see in this report published by UNICEF last year in August. The highest risk places on Earth contribute the least to the causes of climate change. The 33 extremely high-risk countries emit less than 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The 10 most extremely high-risk countries emit only 0.5% of global emissions. So again, the issue of inequities emerges. With the aim of sorting these issues, human societies all over the planet have come together. Scientists have been providing evidence for decades, and politicians from all over the world have been meeting and making agreements and signing agreements, and then making reports on where each country is on their pledges. But when we read these pledges, we notice that they are aspirational and sometimes not concrete enough. And as psychologists, we know that concrete plans are needed in order to implement overall intentions into practice. We also understand that in order to develop any measure with chances for implementation, we will need to engage users and stakeholders and account for contextual constraints. In order to implement any plan and to have this plan be accepted and feasible to implement, as well as sustainable across time, it is crucial to engage all local stakeholders and communities and to fully understand contextual constraints. This is what intervention development frameworks call for. Whatever aspirational pledges and measures governments, communities, neighborhoods, and individuals want to put into practice, it is important that we take into account psychological knowledge in order to assure that these measures have more chances of being successful. There is no time for complacency, and we need all hands on deck. And this is even more important when researchers quantifying the pledges made before COP26 suggested that there is a less than 50% chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. In this paper, published last week, the authors demonstrate that warming can be kept just below 2 degrees Celsius if all conditional and unconditional pledges are implemented in full and on time. Limiting warming not only to just below, but to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius urgently requires policies and actions to bring about steep emission reductions this decade, aligned with mid-century global net zero carbon emissions. So what resources psychology has to bring? Psychologists for decades have been amassing evidence on determinants of behavior, understanding what motivates people to change, and using this knowledge to develop interventions. There is a plethora of intervention development frameworks available. There's many characteristics that these intervention development frameworks share. I would say 3 are crucial. One of them is that the need to be evidence-based, so that interventions target proven scientific mechanisms of action. The second key characteristic, in my view, is engaging with users and stakeholders to assure interventions are acceptable and feasible. And the third is to make sure that whatever is proposed takes into account contextual constraints. If these 3 things are met, we are so much more sure that whatever we propose is acceptable, feasible, and will be sustainable across time. These 2 schematic representations that you see here come from 2 different papers. The first one, published in 2021, last year, by the BMJ, presents the MRC framework for the development and evaluation of complex interventions.
The second paper is a paper I published with colleagues to try to summarize in clusters the different steps that the majority of the intervention and development frameworks suggest. As you can see, core to all these are the importance of considering the context and also the importance of having at its center the user and stakeholder involvement. There's another interesting resource, and this is the Behavior Change Wheel. This paper was published in 2011, and they started writing this paper by doing a systematic search of electronic databases and consulting behavior change experts to identify frameworks of behavior change interventions. They identified 19 at the time, and they covered 9 intervention functions and 7 policy categories that could enable those interventions. At the center of this behavior change wheel is a behavioral system involving 3 essential conditions: capability, as you can see here, opportunity, and motivation. This forms the hub of a behavior change wheel, around which are positioned 9 intervention functions that go from education, persuasion, coercion, and so on, and 7 policy categories that could enable those interventions to occur. The behavior change wheel allows researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to understand that in order to change behavior, multiple types of intervention can be used as long as we understand what are the mechanisms of action that we're trying to target. Armed with this knowledge, my colleague Laura Koenig and myself went on to analyze and critically appraise the EU Farm to Fork strategy, published in 2020. This strategy is at the heart of the European Green Deal, aiming to make food systems fairer, healthier, and environmentally friendlier. Food systems cannot be resilient to crisis if they are not sustainable. We need to redesign our food systems, which today account for nearly 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, consume large amounts of natural resources, result in biodiversity loss and negative health impacts due to both under and overnutrition, and do not allow fair economic returns and livelihoods for all actors, in particularly for primary producers. So we analyzed the strategy and set to understand what could psychology contribute to this document in order to make it more likely to be successfully implemented. From our analysis, we concluded that this strategy includes several actions targeting consumer behavior, including increasing the availability of sustainable and healthy products and mandatory nutritional labeling. The actions address relevant psychological mechanisms. However, the outlined actions are vague and based only on a small number of behavioral determinants that may limit effectiveness. The implementation might furthermore benefit from concepts of implementation science to increase acceptability and feasibility to reach its ambitious goals. Besides, it is important to acknowledge that upstream and downstream interventions are not mutually exclusive, and that countries will implement system-wide policies only if they believe that their population will accept these. Remember here the case of the prohibition to smoke in enclosed spaces, which took decades to implement. Indeed, there are several factors at different levels that influence the initiation and maintenance of behavior of individuals and populations across the lifespan. Well, as the President of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Saeed has stated at the start of this event today, finally, after 15 years of negotiation, access to a healthy environment is declared a human right. All of us can use our knowledge, our influence, and our work to make sure that this happens. To do this, we need to share our knowledge with all, including with policymakers. Next week, there is a PCUN webinar that will be training psychologists on how to write policy briefs. Effective communication between academics and policymakers plays an important role in informing political decision-making and creating impact for researchers, for psychologists, for all of us. I believe the future is bright when we work together for a better future, for our next generation. And I believe that I made it clear that the next generation needs to be included as stakeholder in the work towards a healthier planet. Together, I believe we can do it. This is a list of references, all the things that I referred to and used in my communication can be found here. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Suarez. We will now turn to a question and answer session. Taylor, you've been monitoring the chat. Please tell us about the responses from the audience, and I think we should be seeing more people now joining the speakers, as well as the organizing committee joining this session.
Sure, thanks, Efrat. There were many questions in the Q&A chat and many tokens of appreciation. So congratulations to everyone on their presentations. And thank you for being so informative on this important topic. Let's begin with a question for all the panelists. Feel free to answer this question. What are 1 or 2 psychological contributions that you can suggest for climate action?
Can we start with Timothy, please, with Dr. Hornsey?
Hi, Efrat. So 1 or 2 things for climate action. I think that for me, one of the things that are very important to remember is that it's not just about changing hearts and minds, that you also need to get people to take decisive action. And decisive action requires sacrifice. And I think that one thing that I've observed in my data is that everybody wants to live in a healthy environment. I think that there's real consensus around that. And that's a very easy conclusion to reach. Where the obstacle comes is in terms of allowing people to make sacrifices to make that happen. And that's where you get the resistance. And I do feel as though I've come to the point, and this is probably a little bit odd for me as a psychologist to say this, but that it can't always just be left in the hands of individuals to make those sacrifices. That there needs to be structural and systemic change coming from industry, coming from government, changes that are threaded into our lived experiences, into our realities, so that it becomes habitual and normative to live in a more sustainable way.
Okay. Brendan, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would definitely like to concur with that. And part of my talk really was to emphasize the need to look upstream as well. You know, we are quite good in psychology at looking at individuals and the social context, but also to turn our attention upstream. And I think maybe to add to that is the emphasis on collective action. And I think we could also be turning our attention more so to collective action and mobilization and really enhancing what people are doing already. Thank you.
So Wendy, you emphasize the individual as a clinical psychologist, and now it seems like the consensus is on more institutional or systemic change. So would you like to give your perspective on that?
Absolutely. And I appreciate that clinical psychology usually is thought of as individual work, but I think as we have learned with this crisis, as well as other embedded forms of marginalization and othering, we really do need to look collectively and work collectively. And I think Dr. Barnes made the point earlier that we need to kind of get outside of our silos. So I even think as a clinical psychologist, my work is now moving from the individual work I do, which is still essential and important in helping those who are struggling and suffering. We have innumerable mental health needs and challenges and vulnerabilities that will just keep increasing as the climate crisis gets worse. But we also need to amplify our work and work transdisciplinarily and find sources of support. I know I'm part of the Climate Psychology Alliance. That's a group who is coming together to do this work and to see how we can spread the word more broadly. So providing education, going out into communities, helping parents with how they help their children, helping educators, etc. So I think it's really essential. And I don't think of myself as just working individually. I think it's essential to move more broadly. Thanks.
And Ms. Abrams, would you like to, your work is primarily on the collective level, but would you like to comment on this?
Yes, yeah. Sure, definitely, yes. So as I was speaking in the presentation as well, more than just looking at an individual contribution into behaving pro-environmentally, obviously taking architecture into concern and designers and urban planners taking into consideration for the whole community to start thinking sustainably and also start living sustainably. That would be the way forward to work towards climate action. Yeah.
Okay, Olivia and Taylor collected the many questions in the chats and in the Q&A, and we'll just move now to the questions from the audience. So Olivia, would you like to start with the question to Dr. Greenspan?
Sure, Dr. Greenspan, the question for you is there evidence of resilience strategies to avoid or reduce the trauma effects for groups and communities? And moreover, what approaches would you recommend, given that some populations may not be able to afford one-on-one intervention?
That's an excellent question. And I think I was sort of making some reference to that. Certainly resilient strategies, the strategies that I outlined in my talk can be applied to individuals, but also across communities. And I think the ways to work with communities is to work with the local leaders to find who the natural leaders are within communities, rather than sort of imposing external expertise, but really finding out what works. That idea of transformational wisdom from communities who have been struggling and suffering is really essential. So I think there are many ways to, again, think about moving outside of the individual work to support that. And then also interventions that involve groups. So helping groups of people come together to, I mean, in the work that I do, process the difficult emotions so that they have the energy and capacity and resilience to move forward. So that seems really important too. So that I think there's a variety of ways.
Thank you. Dr. Suarez, Arroyo Suarez, I wanted to ask you about addressing both the individual and the systemic level. So could you please comment on that?
Thank you. I think that sometimes there's some issues about upstream and downstream interventions, and there's some belief that they are separated. I think what I contend, and others also contend, is that these two things are connected. For instance, what happened in Europe, what happened in the United Kingdom when smoking in public spaces was banned. This didn't happen before. There was a clear understanding that there was
like acceptance of this. So I think that whatever it is that we do from here on in terms of the future, and we will need to also bring the public with us, because politicians live in very short terms, and they are thinking about their elections, and they are thinking about trying to do what their voters want them to do, so to speak, in order to get re-elected. So I think it is important that we bring the population also along, and that people understand that a world where the climate is more reliable and the services provided by nature are there is healthier and more secure for all. And once this happens, the political change will occur, as did in other situations in the past.
Thank you. Dr. De Smet, would you like to suggest what would be the contributions of psychology at the
sure.
systemic level?
Well, I think something that psychology can contribute to tackling climate change and environmental health is that we've seen that it's not only giving information and having knowledge. We need to look more at emotional levels also, and make sure that people have some kind of pride in taking on these actions and feel part of a community, and that this is more reinforced. We've seen that with collective action, social movement, the collective efficacy. So I think that's also where I join Vera in her approach. It needs to come from both levels. We need to have, as someone mentioned, we have the micro level, we need to look at the individual actions, but we also need to look at the meso level, at the social level, and it needs to be supported from above, because these politicians will, some people will say, well, we will wait for policy to do something, but politicians on the other side also wait for the individuals, and they say, okay, we will support what our public is ready to take on. So there's clearly an interaction. I think something that psychology can contribute even more that we are not doing yet is, for example, from health psychology, we know that actions that are defined very specifically, if they're more concrete, people are more facilitated in taking action. And I think at this point, this is where the literature on climate change is lacking a bit. We need to be more green. We need to do more for the environment. For example, when it says we need to change our food consumption, well, what is it then exactly? How can we make this specific and measurable? And I think this is something in the future where we can do more that would facilitate action even more.
Thank you so much. Olivia, excuse me, Taylor, do you have a question? I think you have loads of questions. Could you direct a question, take one of the questions for Dr. Hornsey, please?
Sure, absolutely. Dr. Hornsey, a question that came up was, how is the jiu-jitsu technique you mentioned different from inducing cognitive dissonance to change people's views on climate change?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I mean, cognitive dissonance is a situation where you have two conflicting beliefs or values or attitudes, and you feel that anxiety or discomfort about having these conflicting perspectives. And then you have to resolve that anxiety or resolve that dissonance by either changing your attitude or changing your behavior. For me, jiu-jitsu is really about reducing cognitive dissonance. I think cognitive dissonance is the enemy often in terms of bringing people on board with climate science, because quite often people have one truth, which is 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing climate change and that could have catastrophic consequences. On the other hand, you've got this other worldview, which is that I don't believe the government should tell us what to do and the individuals should be able to do what they want, and that the future lies with innovation, with big business, etc. And so to resolve that dissonance, I think quite often people say, well, is that 97% real? Isn't this just a conspiracy? Don't they have vested interests as, in left-wing environmentalists? And you see people reject the science partly to reduce the dissonance. So what I'm trying to do with jiu-jitsu is to reduce the dissonance for them, to make the case that action on climate change is not dissonant with their underlying ideologies and worldviews. And I'm hoping that by doing that, that a lot of the roadblocks for people accepting the science will be removed. Thank you.
Thank you. Olivia, could you share with us one of the questions for Dr. Barnes, please?
Yes, Dr. Barnes, thinking about your work calling for us to break down silos, what steps can we take to bring together psychological research and practice?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I think, firstly, within psychology, it's really important that we start conversing across subfields of psychology, but also to work more with colleagues from other disciplines. I think that's vital, that we have those conversations. I also think research really does matter. And I do think if we're upping our evidence-based game, it'll take us quite a long way in terms of understanding, particularly in contexts where psychology is underrepresented. It'll take us a long way in terms of breaking down some of those barriers. And I think I saw a question also that I might be able to answer through this question. And that is also, I think, breaking down barriers also involves connecting across geographical regions. And I see the question was on the possibilities of collaborating with migration and diaspora in different contexts. And I think, you know, collaborating between geographical regions is vital, as we've seen today. Getting different perspectives from around the world is vital. And in my context, you know, linking Africa with the Pan-African agenda to other parts of the world is particularly important. And I think that's another aspect of breaking down barriers. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And we would like to pose a question to Dr. Desmet. Taylor, can you?
Sure. Absolutely. So we saw in the slide on values and behaviors that the behaviors, both health-related and environmental, were associated with values of universalism. Behaviors were not associated with values of benevolence and tradition. Assuming many people value security, tradition, and benevolence, do you think these behaviors can be framed in a way that will associate them with more values?
Well, yes, absolutely. So what we see right now is that people who are higher in adopting these behaviors are in our sample also higher on these values, but that doesn't mean that the behaviors themselves are incompatible with those values. And I think that's also what Matthew referred to, is we need to make sure that the way that we frame it is consistent with their worldviews or their values. And I think we can really learn a lot from social marketing and from advertisement, where they are able to sell any kind of product to any kind of background, depending on, you know, knowing their audience, and they will frame it in one way for one audience and then frame it in another way for another audience. And I think that's really what we need to do. Sometimes, of course, it will be difficult. So if we look at people who have a high sense of like security, traditionalism, conservatism as their values, and we're coming with the message of reducing meat consumption, and in their culture, meat consumption is very important. That may be a difficult message, but we can also look at kind of like sub-behaviors that do fit with these sustainable development goals. So like having it more animal friendly, using all parts of the animal, which also reduces the fact that we are wasting. So I think we can look at different ways of making behaviors match with values, and we need a segmented approach that relies on marketing.
Thank you. And our last question will be to Andrew Abram and Olivia. Can you select one of the questions?
Yes, Dr. Abraham, this relates to how our offices and homes increasingly are not built in ground level, and this makes it difficult for older people to access. So the question is the field of architecture thinking about this changing age demographic and how it should affect future architectural design?
Yes, thank you for the really interesting question. So that is something that we are working towards and striving towards in the Indian scenario as well, of working towards building cities and public spaces that are more in tune towards being inclusive to everybody. So a very important design criteria there that we can use, that we have been trying to use and using mostly in the Western world, but trying to use and build it up forward in the Indian scenario is barrier-free environments. So obviously the livelihood and the daily activities of elderly people is a little barred here because of their mobility issues, and obviously the buildings being high-rise right now all over the cities. So building up barrier-free environments where elderly people as well as disabled people have the ability to walk around or even move from their homes to a public space and also move forward to their workspaces with the help of inclusion of these barrier-free design criteria, including ramps, which is a very, very general example or a design inclusion of what you can try and do within public spaces. That is something that we are striving towards in the South Asian scenario as well, where public spaces should be more inclusive towards elderly people as well as disabled people. So that's a very interesting question, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you all panelists for your thoughtful answers. And I think we have, it is time for us to end this part of the webinar. I hope that our audience enjoyed and got a deeper understanding of climate change issues from a psychological point of view. Let us turn now to Dr. Marcotte, who will present a PCUN stand on current events in Eastern Europe.
Thank you for attending the 2022 Psychology Day at the United Nations. Before we adjourn, we would like to share a message with you. PCUN, the coalition of psychological non-governmental organizations active at the United Nations, wishes to express our deep concern over the current situation in Ukraine. As psychologists engaged in research, teaching, and practice, we stay united in our values. Peace and security are vital for the well-being of all adults and children. The science and practice of psychology does not recognize geopolitical boundaries, nor does our commitment to social justice for all. We recognize the interdependence of all citizens on the planet and the degree to which our connections have been facilitated by technology. The Ukrainian situation affects us all. As social scientists, we are aware of the radiating effects of the invasion, including death and suffering, hunger, human displacement, physical destruction, and cultural loss. Our hearts go out to those in Ukraine. Our hearts go out to its neighbors. Our hearts go out to the millions of individuals thousands of miles away. Our coalition, the Place for Psychology at the United Nations, views the situation in Ukraine as a clarion call for the human community to abandon violence and aggression in managing conflict and to embrace the way of dialogue and peace in all its affairs. We have hope. As psychologists, we know of the resiliency and positive spirit of the human psyche. We have dedicated our careers and energies to understanding how science and practice can improve the human condition and support its incredible resilience. We never lose hope. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I echo Dr. Marcotte that Ukraine crisis and the crises around the world, psychologists are hugely responsive to this. In fact, we have also prepared a tool for refugees for identifying human trafficking, whether it's Ukraine, Myanmar, Yemen, and other parts of the world. Thank you to our audience for your very insightful questions and comments. I will share 5 action items for psychologists and you are human-centric attendees. But first, I would like to acknowledge these amazing people you see on the screen, including myself, by the way, then give them thanks specially. Dr. Efrat Netta, co-chair, Dr. Vera Arroyo Suarez, co-chair, Olivia Friedman, doctoral student, Taylor Mulligan Stark, master's student, and also Josephine, who was our APA intern during this time. Finally, before we discuss these action items, I give thanks to our audience and sponsors who made this webinar possible. You can see them all proudly displayed on the screen. We give special thanks to the IAP, the ICP, the American Psychological Association, Divisions 52, Divisions 1, and Divisions 12 of the American Psychological Association, the SPSSI, the European, the EHPS, which is for short, and the OV. We thank all of you, and we especially thank the missions of the Dominican Republic and Mexico and His Excellencies who spoke to us today. Thank you all for all that you've done to make today happen. Special thanks to Excellencies for highlighting the tangible and intangible effects at a deeply emotional and personal level and the co-anxieties of the future. Thank you to our highly valued panelists. We were charged in the beginning to formulate solutions, which you have just heard. And we do have a call of action. In fact, we have 5. First, we need to transition from focus on purely green issues to intersectional justice and interdisciplinary communications, thereby removing silos between us, both between nations and between professions. Second, behavioral change can be achieved by addressing underlying beliefs and motivations by using the values, the very values that our audience has. Third, by being mindful of restoration, wayfinding, or place attachment, we can enhance the happiness factor within our and other spaces. Fourth, each of us can engage in co-beneficial behaviors, several examples of which you have been able to see in the slides. Fifth, we ask of you, whether you're a psychologist or not, to become a psychology climate action ambassador, promoting mental and emotional well-being, which is the Sustainable Development Goal number 3. And we ask everyone who attended to go out and spread hope for the future of our climate, forming a catalytic sequence for climate action, addressing SDGs 12 and 14. Thank you all for walking the walk. At this time, I would like you to look at the slide again. Right under the words that says thank you, the survey link is there. You can take a picture and then copy and paste it on your browser. Send in your survey, send in your link, and we will send you your attendance certificate. For those who are psychologists and have applied for CE credits, click on the link below. And if you have signed up for CE credits, you will be given an evaluation form, which will be sent to you at your emails. Complete those and you receive 3 CE credits. Thank you so much for being with us today. We thank you for your valued time. And at this point, we celebrate Psychology Day on our planet, and we bid you goodbye. Till the next time. Thank you.